If a player cleans his ball during play of a hole, except on the putting green, he shall incur a penalty of 1 stroke. That's the rule, Jerry.
But it's just a friendly game. Why do you always have to be such a stickler?
Because that's the way I was raised.
Welcome to Spirit of the Game, brought to you by the Colorado Golf Association. Here are your hosts, Ed Mate and Lewis Harry.
All right, we are back. Welcome to another edition of Spirit of the Game. This is Ed Mate.
And Lewis Harry.
Last one of the year. This is it. Putting a bow on 2023, and we're going to have some fun with this one and kind of introduce a thematic trend we're going to use for a little while anyway. We'll see how it goes. We're going to do a series of deep dives. This one is going to focus on dissecting the drop. How did we arrive at dropping a golf ball? It's quite a long, winding road that's brought us to where we are today. 2023, we're now dropping from knee height. It wasn't always that way. So tell us a little bit about the history of this, would you? I know you love history.
Sure. Dropping is it's what I think is probably the most important rule in the book. People might argue differently. There's other rules that are more important, but I think dropping is the most important one, because if you look at our book today in 2023, look at Rule 14. It's the longest rule in the book. Right? I don't know how many pages off the top of my head it encompasses, but any time we have a procedure for the ball that does not involve a stroke, so it involves either picking up the ball, putting it down, dropping it, marking it, anything that Rule 14 encompasses today, there's a reason why that rule is so long, and there's a reason why it's in the middle of the book, and why it comes before any of the relief rules, because we need to get that out of the way before we get to any of the other procedures. We've mostly always had a procedure for ball somewhere in the rules of golf. As we know, we have two main principles of the rules of golf: play the ball as it lies and play the course as you find it. But as we also know, that's not always the case. There's times where we don't play the ball as it lies, and there's times where we don't play the course as we find it. And in those times where we don't play the ball as it lies, we're usually picking the ball up. When the ball is in our hands, we have to have some mechanism to get the ball back down on the ground. Thus comes the drop. So, like you mentioned and you alluded to, it's taken a lot of different forms over the years from the beginnings of dropping the ball. There's a lot of different reasons why you've introduced in the rules where a drop would come into effect, mostly for relief reasons, but there's a lot of different reasons why we would pick a ball up and put it back down under the rules of golf. So we've done a little bit of history into the drop in our own research. There's a really great website. If there's any rules nerds listening, if you're listening to this podcast, you probably have some interest in the rules of golf.
You are, by definition, a rules nerd if you've even made it in 2 minutes into this podcast.
Yeah, or you have some.
And we say that. I say that with all. I'm serious. I love nerds, because really nerd means you really have a deep interest in a subject, and that's pretty cool.
I appreciate anyone who has even a surface level interest in the rules of golf. Yeah. So. But there's a great website if anyone's interested in the history of the rules, ruleshistory.com. It has a copy of every prior code of the rules of golf dating back to pre-1800s. The website, if you go past 1952, you're going to find the R&A versions of the rules of golf. Obviously, 1952 on. The USGA and the R&A jointly issued the rules of golf, so that is the same. But if you go into any of the rules prior to 1952, you're going to find the R&A version on the website. But in addition to having the different codes, they also have a section on each different topic. So if you want to find the history of water hazards and penalty areas, there's an entire page you can dive into those histories. If you want to find the entire history on the stymie rule, it's there, one page for you, and you can dive in. But we're focusing on lifting, dropping today, and there's a whole page on playing the ball, which includes lifting and dropping. So we'll dive a little bit into the history. We have some notes we've made about the history of the drop. We'll go over a couple of them, and then we'll dive into some other topics as well with history of the drop and where it's going today and where it might be going in the future as well, because As we all know, that the rules change. They usually change in a 4-year cycle. The last couple cycles have been 2019 was a major cycle. This last one wasn't too major, but there may be a cycle in the future where we go through a rules change where the drop possibly goes away. So we have one of our first pieces up here. It's 1754, where we have a note about throwing behind water 6 yards at least. And if we compare that to what the drop is today in 2023, that's quite a difference there. Would you agree?
No, absolutely. Again, the very original 13 Rules of Golf said, and I think the exact quote is, if you hit your ball into water or other watery filth, you shall throw the ball behind the water 6 yards at least, and maybe the 6 yards was added, and allow your opponent a stroke for the misfortune, which I love the way watery filth and a stroke for the misfortune. So that was the first, obviously in the very first code, we had to figure this one out. What do you do when you lose that feathery? Oh my gosh, or that wooden block, whatever it was. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like we kind of mentioned before, we're basing the game off of the principle that we're playing the ball as it lies, but when that's not always possible, we need some sort of mechanism to get that ball back into into play or back to where we can make a stroke at it. So we've always had the need for this, for what essentially is the drop.
Okay, what happened next?
Oh, we fast forwarded a handful of years here. I think from 1754, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't believe that was even the RNA yet. I think that was a Honorable Company of Edinburgh Golfers rule.
Right, exactly. And I'm sure if there's any RNA experts out there, I don't know exactly when the RNA was formed officially and became a rulemaking body, but again, it kind of speaks to the local rules is where it all started with the Edinburgh, the Honorable Company.
Yep, and I believe even 1809 here with our next jump forward, this even still might be an Honorable Company of Edinburgh Golfers.
Right.
I believe we don't get to RNA until our next one in 1858.
I wonder what made them honorable. Do you think they really were honorable? Do you think they just said that?
It could be a self-appointed title.
I guarantee you there were some dishonorable people. There was a sandbagger in there. There was a cheater.
There's
I guarantee you cheating has been around forever.
one in every crowd. So 1809, we have I hesitate to call it a provision, but we have what David Stabler, he has a word for it. I don't know. If David Stabler's listening, please let me know what your word for it is. But so if a ball is in water, and I believe they may even call it out as a hazard at this point, but if a ball's in water, the player is able to tee it behind the water. Otherwise, they're going to drop it.
Right.
So we have this. What first we see is maybe an exception to a rule, is what we would see today with the ball being in the water. If it's not in the water, we're going to do this. If it's in the water, we're going to do that. So we see the first of that kind of shaping to the rules.
Yeah, sort of tinkering. And obviously, this pretty much shines the light on the fact that this is a very fluid, dynamic process. We've always seek to improve. That's our nature as human beings. And so I don't know what led to that. Why, when your ball was in water, you're allowed to tee it versus otherwise. Maybe because there was a penalty associated with it and there wasn't penalties for other drop. Who knows? But that's an interesting little ripple in the history.
The word is proviso, by the way.
Oh,
so there's
okay.
a proviso that if the ball is in water, it may be teed.
Okay, good word.
Yeah.
Word of the day.
There you
Proviso.
go.
Okay.
So we fast forward a few more years, 1858. I believe now we're in the world of the RNA. I believe now the RNA has begun as a rule-making body for the game of golf, the governing body. And I believe this is now part of the RNA's code as of 1858. So now, and we see some form of this still existing today. It's not exactly what it was, 200 years ago, almost 200 years ago, but we still see some form of this today, and it introduces dropping on a line. And what we still see today is our relief option for back on the line relief. So this, if anyone thinks that dropping on a line is new, that's by far not the case. It has existed in the rules for a long time.
Well, and it was a major topic of discussion in rural circles in recent history. With it, where in 19, again, my decades or my centuries are getting blended now. In 2019, the dropping back on a line was changed, where a ball could drop and roll forward, where in the past, prior up till then, it couldn't, and now we're kind of we can get into that, but that'll take us too far down that line. So anyway, my point is, we continue to meddle and try to improve, and sometimes when you meddle and try to improve, you make mistakes, and that is an example of that.
Now we're in a little bit more modern times. We finally cracked the 1900s here with our original list, 1902. And this is the first introduction of placing the golf ball. Up until this point, there really wasn't placing in the rules. It was really dropping was the mechanism used to get the ball back into play. But as we know now, placing is part of our game and part of the rules. There's many times where we place the ball, mostly on the putting green, we're placing the ball, but there's times in the general area, other places we place the ball in the rules. But 1902, this is the first introduction of placing the golf ball. And in 1902, the only place we were placing was on the putting green. It was limited to that area of the golf course at this point.
Right. Well, and it just shows, this evolutionary history shows just how more often we get you can see a trend here. We're getting our hands on the ball a lot more often. Mm-hmm. The original shepherds hitting it that rabbit's run off in the distance that was the joy of the game. It's just got to get it in the hole without touching it. And we have definitely eroded that principle. And obviously in modern times where lift, clean, and place is become so ubiquitous, we really, some would argue, have really lost one of the most important tenets of the rules, which is don't touch the ball. The club gets the ball the whole night in your hands. The likelihood of getting our paws on it now is just exponentially higher than what it once was. And it's interesting. It took over hundreds of years to even come up with the idea of placing. So, but we're now there in 1902.
Sure are.
Okay, so now so that's kind of just a big macro view. Now talk about the methods. How do you drop? What does dropping mean specifically, and how has that process evolved?
Well, it's always, even from its earliest days, if we rewind back to where we started in 1754, the drop itself has always involved, and we're going to use this word, and we're going to see it again here as Ed moves into the future and talks about the modernization a little bit more, but it's always involved some sort of release from your hands, right? Where it's not, and even in the early days, when we're throwing the golf ball, that's really the only times we see any sort of effect put on the golf ball. Once we start dropping over our head, over our shoulders, from arm's length into today, it really just involves the hands letting go of the golf ball and letting it fall wherever it falls. As we know today, when we drop the ball today, we're not allowed to spin it, flick it, roll it, try and toss it somewhere else. We just got to let it go and let it fall through the air by itself. In the 1700s, in the early times of dropping, where the throw is involved, that's really the only time we see where a player is allowed to influence where the ball might go during this procedure. So,
no, a really good point. I hadn't really thought about the throw, because you're exactly right. There's a sort of fatalistic, and this is absolutely the key to this entire discussion in my view, and that is the randomness. The golfing gods, as I always say, are going to determine where you're going to play your next stroke, not you. And you should have very little influence over that. And that really reared its head, as we'll talk here in a minute, in the modernization, when that concept of randomness was being challenged for good reason, and for there was a logic behind getting rid of that. But ultimately, that essential piece of the get the ball back in play is really the fundamental principle. It's really it's almost like it should be added to play the ball as it lies in the course as you find it. And when you need to get the ball back in play, randomness is going to determine it. It's that vital to the game's essence. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, it's
I would. Yes, I would agree.
Yeah.
So a lot of early variants in the method of dropping a ball. Again, we started in 1754 where we're throwing it at least 6 yards. In 1776, I don't know if this is a similar code of rules, but the Edinburgh Burgess set of rules required you to throw it over your head. 1809, we go back to the Edinburgh Company, or Honorable Company of Edinburgh Golfers. That one, again, we're doing a similar thing that we
By the
were
way,
doing.
can I just interject here for a minute? You're very good at quoting rules by number, like 15.2. Can you quote them when they were in 1860? What number it was? Can you please tell me what the number was then? I want you to memorize all those numbers going back into 1754.
Yeah, that would be a good one. I do know that in
The Rain Man.
I do know that when the USGA and the RNA started jointly administering the code, it was 22. Dropping was rule 22.
Okay.
In the times leading up to before we modernized in 19, it was 20-2.
Okay.
And obviously today it's 14.
Obviously, it's
So-
14 now. Yeah. For anybody knows
yeah,
that. Everybody knows.
Yeah, I'll work on
Okay,
I'll
sorry.
work on
Couldn't
those-
help myself there.
We'll work on the numbers in the 1800s.
Okay. All right. I didn't mean to distract you. Keep going.
No, so 1812, this is kind of the introduction of where we see a little more the shifting of the process here. We're facing the hole and then now dropping over our head. So that's the introduction of where a player is required to face the hole. Before, it didn't really say in the rules what they had to do. It just told them this is the procedure for it, and this is how you do it. Now we're requiring the player to face the hole to drop over their head in 1812. 1825, we adopt what is the over-the-shoulder drop, and that's kind of the basis, what sets us up for a pretty long run here with over-the-shoulder. This lasts for, trying to do some quick math here, this lasts for almost 159 years?
That's a pretty good run. Yeah.
That procedure had some longevity to it.
Yep.
That the over the shoulder did quite the run there, but so that got introduced in 1825. In 1899, we added a few more requirements when we're dropping: face the hole, stand erect. We're dropping, from your head over your shoulder. That's where that process gets laid out in 1899 by the RNA, and then that's the process there that takes us to almost up to 1984.
Right.
So I have a quote here from the 1952 rules. This is the first year of the jointly administered rules by the RNA and the USGA, Rule 22. So again, a ball shall be dropped in the following manner: the player himself, which again, shows you that this is the evolution of the rules. Today we would never refer to a player as their gender in the rules of golf.
No, and that actually was finally resolved in 2019. I think up until then there was some sort of disclaimer that, for simplicity, we're going to just use the.
Yeah, there was a lot of,
the male
even in
pronoun.
2012, 2016, they got rid of a lot of them. But if you looked in like the definition of something, sometimes it's still called out the player by he or him.
There you go.
Anyways.
A long history there.
So the player himself shall drop it. He shall face the hole, stand erect, and drop the ball behind him over his shoulder. If the ball touched the player, there is no penalty. If the ball dropped in any manner other than described above, the player is penalized 1 stroke.
Wow.
So, and we still have that today, where if a player drops a ball incorrectly and doesn't fulfill all of the requirements of our dropping rule, and then plays that ball, that player still incurs a 1-stroke penalty, even today,
right.
because we need to get that procedure right.
Well, and to be very clear, there's always been an escape clause. Not always, but there was what we used to call the eraser rule. We now can call it the undo rule to modernize it.
I still call it the eraser rule, 14.5.
Yeah. Where you can, as long as you don't play a stroke, you can redo it.
Yep, you can
correctly.
correct that mistake and do it the right way, and you can get off scot-free.
Right.
So that is from our 1952 rules. Again, in 1980, we have some similar rules. We're still not quite to 84 yet, where we see a big change. That again, this This procedure has been lasting for almost a century and a half. So we've been running with over-the-shoulder dropping. We're still there here in 1980. But again, we see the same procedure. A ball dropped into the rules or local rules shall be dropped by the player himself. He shall face the hole, stand erect, drop the ball behind him over the shoulder. And if the ball is dropped in any other manner, the player shall incur a penalty stroke. So even in 1980, we're still seeing the same dropping procedure that we saw in 1952, that we saw in 1930, that we saw pretty much in 1899. So this is a long time for this dropping procedure. We finally get to 84. 84 is where we see a new dropping procedure for the first time in, like I said, 159 years, I think. And this is where I know this dropping procedure because this was the dropping procedure when I started playing golf. A lot of people who still play the game today, this is how they know how to drop the ball. Even though we've had our new rules in effect for over 4 years now, this is still how people have in their heads, a lot of people have in their heads how to drop a golf ball. So this is where we go to a ball held out at arm's length and drop straight down without influencing the ball, just reaching out, letting the ball go, letting it fall through the air, and then hitting the ground.
Well, and standing erect. That's really important.
Standing erect is also the key piece of that. Again, this is also where the rule goes from Rule 22 to 20-2.
Right. It's interesting, the numbering of the rules. So when I sat on the Rules of Golf Committee, which is a good segue to 2019 and the modernization process, there was a couple very senior members of the committee, Bill Williams and Reed McKenzie, and they were involved in the 84 redo of the book. And just to kind of sort of put some color on how significant the 2019 changes were, they both said this 84 was minor relative to 2019 because they didn't rewrite the book. They just reorganized the book. So the numbering system, there used to be 40 rules, and they condensed it to 34. I think it was then. I lose track.
It went to 35 at one point, then back to 34, and
Right.
then now to 24, and then now just back to 25.
Yeah.
So we've had a lot of numbers.
Right. So anyway, the point is that that really shows just how significant the 2019 modernization was. It was the most ambitious rewrite of the rules, and you think what necessitated that was all the history leading up to it. There was a lot to rewrite. Up until that time, it just got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and so finally they all looked at each other at the Joint Rules Committee and said, I think we can slim this thing down. And it all kind of started the ball rolling, and no pun intended. And that really led to the book that we now use today, and I think a pretty amazing accomplishment, the modernization. I know we talk about it all the time, but it really is it's something that anybody involved in the process, or it just made the game infinitely more intuitive, and the language is easier. It's just much improved. So, I had the good fortune, as I often say, to be on the Rules Committee during this time, thanks to my good friend Thomas Pagel, who invited me to sit in the seat that's reserved for a member of the State and Regional Golf Association community, now known as AGAs, as a consulting member, an advising member. I didn't realize I didn't have a vote, which didn't deter me from speaking up and proving my ignorance on many, many topics. But I'll never forget this. I was at Golf House. The year was 2015, I think. It was my first Rules of Golf Committee meeting, and the topic on the table was what we're talking about here, dropping. And I was sort of walked into that meeting expecting, because this was the talk, the speculation was that the biggest change you're going to see in 2019 is the elimination of the drop. It's the end of the line. We're going to place, every time you get a ball back in play, we're going to place. The rationale behind it was simplification. As you alluded to earlier, it's the lengthiest rule in the book. There's so many things that come with random that you have to deal with, the what ifs. If you're placing a ball, those what ifs are pretty slim. So that was really what was leading the proposal. So when I entered the room, that's kind of what I expected, was that we're going to be placing the ball. And much to my surprise, a new concept was being discussed, and that was the release. And I've always described this as if dropping and placing had a baby, it would be a release. And that is where you place the ball on the ground and let go of it. So if it does turn a little bit, doesn't stabilize on the exact spot, you are going to play it from where it comes to rest. So there is a very small bit of random in there, a lot less because your hand, ball, ground are all in contact with one another. So the likelihood of the ball going very far is infinitely smaller. So we talked about it for a long time and the what ifs but that was the concept. It was a release. So the way the rules of golf are written and revised and ultimately adopted is it first starts at the committee level at both the USGA and the R&A, then goes to a joint rules committee. So it was always interesting to come back after because I was not on the joint rules committee. I was on the lower committee. And you come back months later and you learn, oh, they rewrote the entire thing or they didn't adopt that. So I learned when I came to the next meeting that the release was deemed to be too confusing, was going to introduce all kinds of unintended breaches where people are picking it up instinctively when it moves a little bit, probably true. So they said, we got to get it out of the contact with the ground so it does draw a stark, clear line between dropping and placing. This is too similar to a place. So they said, all right, how about 1 inch? Let's drop it at least, no more. I don't know if it was at least, but it was 1 inch. So great. That was the new plan. And again, what's driving this is the concern over random. There needs to be some random, you cannot place the ball. That's really going back to the very beginning. So in March of 2018, which was the opening of the comment period, if anybody wants to go back and study this, it's there. The 1 inch was proposed. Well, lots of comments came back, some loving changes, some really hating them, whatever, usual stuff. But the 1 inch was really a concern. And the concern was avoid the appearance of evil. And if somebody's dropping from across the fairway and somebody says, hey, you placed it, it needs to be visually apparent that you're dropping the ball. And 1 inch is not enough. So lo and behold, after the comment period, the knee height was the compromise. So after all this discussion, let's place it, let's get rid of the drop, let's release it. It still preserves randomness, but it's pretty close. And then 1 inch to a knee height. So we started going all the way to a place and ended up backpedaling to knee height. So that's where we are today. A lot of initial confusion and angst about it. I loved Robert Duke's description at a rules seminar. Just imagine you're petting a dog. That's basically the height. And I thought that's a good way to think of it. Most dogs are about knee height, and it's not that hard. But again, because we were so fixated on standing erect, so fixated on arm's length, it was hard. As you said earlier, in the procedure that you grew up on and that I grew up on, arm's length, shoulder height, was kind of a big shift. So that's where we are today. We've come a long way. I've always thought I should have a bumper sticker that shows, the evolution of man walking on 4 and then walking on 2 legs. The evolution of the drop would be a guy throwing it to shoulder height, all this, and then eventually. So as we that's where we are today, and as we take an eye to the future, if I had to predict, I would say the way the trend is going, first of all, what we're doing now is not going to last 159 years. I'm pretty certain we're going to not, avoid or have the restraint to continue to dabble. I think the dabbling is here to stay, and the next dabble, I think, is a place. And the same rationale that was recommended or led up to the idea that we're going to just get rid of it, the simplification, I think, is going to win the day. I do know that having sat on that committee for 4 years, that there was a lot of people in the room that felt that's where we really should be, but we weren't quite there yet. So I would say, I don't know when, but in the next 10 years, I will predict, and we can go back in the archives and listen to this, that we will be placing and that the drop is forever removed and will go by the way of the stymie and, penalties for striking flag sticks and things that are just they're part of the history books.
Well, the rules are, they're always changing. They're always, I wouldn't say changing, they're always evolving. Mm-hmm. And as we move forward and the game evolves, the rules to keep up and to be applicable to the way the game is evolving, we just there's things that have to change.
So would you be in favor, if you were on the rules committee, if we were the poobahs, and it's just up to the two of us, would you be in favor of eliminating the drop and going to a place?
I will preface this with, at this time, no.
Okay. And your reason?
Because and it goes back to, I think the randomness, and I think that plays a factor into it, right? There's randomness after every stroke. And I think the randomness to get a ball back into play, I think should still, now I could be swayed. I could be easily swayed to get out of that line of thinking. But at this time, I think that's where my head is at.
So when I was on the rules committee, I got to meet some really great people, and Martha Lang became a good friend and a former mid-amateur champion and just a wonderful human being. And she said to me, sitting next to me, said, "Ed, you need to pick a few less hills to die on," because I would be so adamant about. She said it with a smile on her face, and it was well received. So in terms of hills to die on, it's funny because as I reflect on this, because I was firmly in favor of a place, and said as much during the course of my time on the committee, when there was still some openness to the concept. But when it became pretty clear that this was a fait accompli, we were going to drop in some way, shape, or form, I let go of it, no pun intended. But I would have to say today, I am emphatically in favor of keeping the drop. I'm going to surprise you here. And here's my reason. As I said a minute ago, what are the fundamental principles of golf? Play the ball as it lies in the course as you find it. And when you can't do that, there's a saying, do what's fair. But I would add to that, when you return a ball into play, fate has to play some hand in it in most cases. And part of the reason I think I've sort of evolved back to a more conservative position on this is the continued advocacy from a surprising number of golfers that you should get relief for a ball that's in a divot. And it amazes me that we have not sort of put that to rest, and that there's more that just keeps coming up. I ask all the time, what's one rule you would change? And almost 9 times out of 10, you get relief from and my fear is that eventually that voice is going to win out, and we're going to be giving relief for balls and divots. And if that happens, the game is lost, in my opinion. At that point, the game is no longer golf. And so why are these two things connected? At least in my mind, they're connected because there's an unfairness that go to both of them. It's not fair. I dropped the ball and it went into a bad lie. So what? I'm sorry. That's not fair. I hit a perfect tee shot and it's in the divot. That's not fair. In the moment we let go of, we're slowly but surely trying to, and it's true everywhere, not just in golf. It's true in every sport where a player commits a penalty and they look at it in an instant replay and that's not fair. They got it wrong. So we introduced instant replay to solve for fairness. And so it really worries me. And if we go to a place, to me, that's a big step toward divot relief, just because at that point the slope has gotten so slippery that you're now basically placing it every time you hit a shot. So that's where I am on this date in history.
All right. It's to be determined where we go from there.
Yeah. Well, that was a deep dive. That was good. And we're going to do more of these. I hope the listeners enjoyed this deep discussion. I thought of this from the very beginning, but I think it's time to drop the mic.
That's a good...
Drop the mic on... We're dropping the mic literally here. We have microphones in front of us, but it's been a fun year. 2023 is in the books. Yeah. 2024 is not a rules change year.
It is not. It'll be the first... Well, we had a cycle change in 23. So we will continue on with the same book if it were 24. Now, there might be clarifications added. We didn't have any clarifications added in the last quarter in October, so there were no new clarifications added. But we might have some clarifications added in 24 and some model local rules added. the topic of rollback still lingers in the on the back burner. So we'll kind of see where we go from there.
Yeah, that's going to be a fascinating one to see. It seems like the teasers coming out as we're recording are that the next announcement is imminent. And I think the next announcement, as the comment period comes to a close, is they're going to roll it back for all of us. That's sort of the sense I have, and I think it just the hand played out in a very interesting way, where the pushback from the tour and the PGA of America, most notably, was that they don't want to bifurcate the rules, even though they're already bifurcated. But in this particular instance, we should all play the same ball. So we're all going to suffer with a shorter golf ball. So that'll be fascinating to see, because they've teed it up perfectly for the USGA and the R&A to make that statement. So that's what I see in my crystal ball. But we'll probably maybe before the end of the year, we'll see an official announcement around that.
Well, if anyone has any professional 90s lying around, might as well start playing with those.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the first ball I remember was the Wilson Pro Staff, was the ball I played, which Jerry Pate played when he won the Players' Championship with an orange version of it. Last question before we wrap. Will you be going to a rules seminar? Are you going to take the test again next year? You're going to start your off-season study, I assume.
It's already started. I start my off-season studying usually before Thanksgiving.
Okay.
So but if I start it before Thanksgiving, that usually gives me over 2 months.
Okay.
And I study every day, aside from Saturday, Sunday.
Okay. So what do you do on those days?
So yeah, if you look at my Outlook calendar, there's a block every day.
And that's why you know every
study.
number, and that's why you're so good at it, and that's why we love you as our rules and comps director.
But there is I'll be attending the Atlanta workshop. This is the expert workshop in Atlanta.
Awesome.
At the end of January. And I will also be attending the refereeing workshop at Sawgrass in February.
You know,
So
it's
really looking forward to. I mean, I've been to the Atlanta one in 24. That'll be my 7th or 8th workshop I've been to. So really, the regular 4 days, those are kind of just routine at this point. I'm really looking forward to the refereeing one because that's something new, and excited to see what they have to offer there.
Well, it's like a language. You got to stay fresh, and you're always learning. So
and then I will be taking the 100-question exam.
all right.
Already for this cycle, my score from last year is good through the rest of the cycle. So
Take some pressure off.
Really no pressure for this one,
good.
except for just the continued quest for the 100. So.
There we go. Okay, a noble pursuit. All right, let's wrap.
All right.
Until next time.
See you next year.